Thanks to the financial broadside levelled on Formula One by the coronavirus pandemic, a few Formula One teams would be forgiven for getting a little bit hot under the collar when it comes to perusing balance sheets. Last time, the global financial crisis almost changed the face of Formula One forever. Honda, Toyota and BMW all pulled out, while Subaru, powered by the Honda team, pulled out midway through 2008. For 2010, approximately 15 teams submitted entries, from which the FIA chose 3, subsequently adding a 4th after Toyota withdrew. F3 stalwarts Manor, led by John Booth, was the first, joined by GP2 squad Campos Racing and the upstart US F1 squad, headed by Peter Windsor. After Toyota elected to end its expensive and fruitless F1 tenure, only Fernandez's Lotus team got the call up too as late as September, meaning they had to put a team together in just 6 months to make the grid. This came amid a genuine threat of a split between the manufacturer entities that made up FOTA, the Formula One Teams Association, and the FIA-aligned non-FOTA teams, consisting of Williams, Force India and any new teams added to the field. Although the threat of an F1 FOTA split was eventually diffused, the resource restriction agreement eventually became collateral in ending the prospective breakaway. With one fell swoop, the performance benefits that all of the new teams would get were gone, and that left them in a precarious position before the 2010 season even began. Lola, one of the favourites to receive an entry, was conspicuous by its absence. Meanwhile, former Formula Renault 3.5 and LMP team Epsilon Euskadi was beaten to becoming Spain's first F1 constructor by Campos, which itself was very close to failing to make the grid. A decade on, perhaps it's fitting to reflect on the 2010 entry process and look at the circumstances in which the biggest teams failed to make the cut. So in this series, we'll investigate some of those planned entries with insight from those involved. Firstly, let's start with Prodrive. A hot favourite to make the move up to F1, the illustrious Prodrive team was ultimately given short shrift by the governing body. With years of success in diverse categories of racing, Prodrive had won the British Touring Car Championship with BMW and Ford, and the World Rally Championship with Subaru. Chairman and co-founder David Richards had also enjoyed a successful time in F1 with BAR. He turned an inefficient squad, squandering British-American Tobacco's large war chest, into the team that grabbed second in the 2004 Constructors' Championship before Honda took control of the team. But just a couple of years before F1 opened its biggest ever tender process for new teams, Prodrive had actually already managed to secure an entry to motorsport's biggest arena. Planning to join the fray in 2008, Richards had spotted the loosening of the requirements to manufacture everything by the FIA, and thus became the stimulus for Prodrive's entry to Formula One. Now, the original Concord Agreement stated that teams must manufacture everything themselves, but then FIA President Max Mosley was worried that it was making F1 too expensive. In response to that, Richards and Prodrive had discussions with McLaren, with a deal agreed to take on their cars. Citing the new testing restrictions, Richards convinced McLaren that supporting a parallel team would help to partially circumvent that. At the time, McLaren also had a surplus of excess and conflicting sponsors, and Richards suggested that they could use Prodrive's team as a larger platform for exposure. With McLaren's support on board, Prodrive had tied up a deal with the Mercedes engines, while providing seats for the drivers on its Young Driver program, which at the time included the likes of test driver Gary Paffett. But there was one aspect of Prodrive's entry that caused considerable consternation between the other teams. Richards had agreed a deal to run a current 2008 spec McLaren. In conversation with Bernie Ecclestone, Richards mentioned that he was planning to run McLaren machinery, and Ecclestone agreed that maybe taking a year-old car was a good idea. But Prodrive's endeavours to take a current spec car left Ecclestone sceptical, and the eventual drip feeding into the press of the team's plans began to leave some of the smaller teams worried. After all, as McLaren won the title in 2008 with its MP423, another 2 of those on the grid would have sent some of the more established outfits down the pecking order, and leaving them with significantly less prize money. So Prodrive, the FIA and FOM were under legal threat by Williams, who was the first team to sign up under the new Concord Agreement. Under increasing scrutiny, Prodrive and McLaren eventually agreed to pull the plug on the deal. But 2 years later, as the FIA reopened its doors for new teams to take to the grid in 2010, Prodrive attempted to rekindle its relationship with McLaren. So once more politics were at play, and Prodrive was eventually left out in the cold as they tried to get to F1 under the new budget cap. At the time, the mass pullout of manufacturers left just Mercedes, Ferrari and Renault on the grid, all as engine suppliers, and each had significant leveraging power. Having been burned by the big spending manufacturer era, Mosley and Ecclestone elected to add an independent engine supplier that they could have dominion over. Cosworth, having already produced a V8 power plant for Williams in 2006, was picked to be the FIA's chosen supplier for the new entries, and Moseley and Ecclestone needed at least 3 teams on board to make the finances work. But once more, Prodrive was planning to take the Mercedes engines and use as many McLaren components as possible. The customer cars banned for 2010, the deal with McLaren would presumably have had to have taken shape similar to Force India's deal with the team, in which they took the rear end, including the gearbox and suspension, which became the precursor to the B-Team model used by Haas later down the line. But Richards and Prodrive, in the process of proving to the FIA that their submission was viable, was met with resistance. Suggestions from the FIA that there would be no entry on the cards unless Prodrive played the game and opted for Cosworth's rather poured cold water on the fire, as the Mercedes deal was already in place. Richards recalled that, despite submitting the entry regardless, it was no surprise to him that Prodrive's entry was denied. That approach exposed some of the flaws and vested interests the FIA had during its 2010 application process, and it appeared to reward gamesmanship rather than putting together the strongest package. Following the company's F1 dalliance, Prodrive returned to the WRC to run the Works mini project, but has since ceded its top-line operations and race teams to focus on non-motorsport activities and its planned Dakar entry next year. But just as Prodrive was snubbed for its refusal to conform to the FIA's demands for Cosworth engines, another engineering company well versed in the field of motorsport had also fallen short in a similar fashion. But we'll get to that next time.